The Wrong Way Home: Uncovering the Patterns of Cult Behavior in American Society by Arthur J. Deikman. Chapter 3: Compliance with the Group. Human beings are social beings. Mother, father, siblings, grandparents, and other relatives form our first social group. The family into which we are born has enormous influence on us, not only because of a long and complex learning process takes place before adulthood and self-sufficiency are attained, but also because the family becomes the paradigm for other social groups. In fact, most social groups share characteristics of family groups with members who occupy dominant, parent, and subordinate, child roles. By considering the characteristics that social groups share with families, we can understand why individuals who are considered independent and adult outside the group may become dependent and childlike within. Of course, the family's adults, who transmit social attitudes, fears, and hopes to the child, are themselves subject to influences of larger social units toward which they may have many of the same dependency feelings that their child has towards them. These overlapping reference groups are composed of friends, colleagues, and/or people of similar religious and political persuasions. Reference groups influence our behavior greatly, although we may not be conscious of how and when this occurs. Conformity to characteristic views, dress, and conduct differentiates social groupings. Marking the most outwardly rebellious as well as the most conventional. An amusing example comes from my own field of psychiatry. Janet Malcolm relates this experience of an analyst of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute who, shortly after he graduated, purchased a black and white herringbone tweed jacket which enormously pleased him. 2 years later, he met a fellow analyst wearing the almost identical jacket. My colleague laughed and said, "But you know, everyone at the New York Psychoanalytic wears this kind of jacket." And so I understood why I had felt so great about my jacket. I began to look around the institute, and sure enough, the jacket was all over the place. Imitation of our peers is basic to learning and development, and the reference group is an important influence throughout life. Social psychologist Albert Bandura and his colleagues were able to cure children of nursery school age fear of dogs by the simple procedure of having them watch another child playing happily with a dog. Even when films were used instead of actual demonstrations, the procedure worked. Even more striking was the research of psychologist Robert O'Connor on socially withdrawn school children who typically stayed on the fringes of peer group activities. Believing that their behavior predicted a pattern of lifelong isolation and social unease, and trying to change that pattern, O'Connor put together a film composed of 11 different nursery school scenes. Each scene showed a different solitary child observing a social activity and then joining in, to everyone's pleasure. O'Connor tried the film on a group of the most severely withdrawn children from 4 nursery schools. The results were impressive. After watching the film, the isolates immediately began to interact with their peers at a level equal to that of the normal children in the schools. Even more astonishing was that O'Connor found, when he returned to the schools 6 weeks later to observe, while the withdrawn children who had not seen O'Connor's film remained as isolated as ever, those who had viewed it were now leading their schools in amount of social activity. It seems that this 23-minute movie, viewed just once, was enough to reverse a potential pattern of lifelong maladaptive behavior. Yes, yet as we know, the power of group influence has its negative side, and not only in cults. For example, research indicates that the reason a group of bystanders may not come to the aid of a victim is not that they are indifferent, heartless, or numbed by urban living, but because in uncertain situation, each person looks to others for cues as to how to interpret and react to what is happening. Each person's passivity reinforces that of others. In contrast, when researchers enacted an emergency in the presence of a single bystander, that person invariably responded helpfully, whether in a city or not. Clearly, reliance on social cues, not empathy, is the issue. Robert Cialdini, an experimental social psychologist, explains that the group's influence on our behavior as being utilitarian. The tendency to see an action as more appropriate when others are doing it works quite well normally. As a rule, we will make fewer mistakes by acting in accord with social evidence than contrary to it. Usually, when a lot of people are doing something, it's the right thing to do. But every society provides numerous examples of group influence which turned out to be injurious to the group itself, as well as unfair and harmful to others. How and why do groups affect their members so strongly? The remarkable influence of groups upon their members has been of interest to psychologists and psychiatrists for a long time. Gustave Le Bon was one of the first to study the behavior in people in crowds and mobs. Writing in 1859 about such situations, he described the disappearance of conscious personality, the predominance of the unconscious personality, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas in an identical direction, the tendency to immediately transform the suggested ideas into acts. Freud believed that these characteristics could be explained as a regression to a primal mental activity, that of the primal horde. The primal form of human society was that of a horde ruled over despotically by a powerful male, just as primitive man survives potentially in every individual. So the primal horde may arise once more out of any random collection. Freud went on to emphasize the contrivance by means of which an artificial group is held together in the constitution of the primal horde. We have seen that with an army and a church, this contrivance is the illusion that the leader loves all of the individuals equally and justly. But this is simply an idealistic remodeling of the state of affairs in the primal horde, where all of the sons knew that they were equally persecuted by the primal father and feared him equally. Freud's analysis is exclusively male focus aside. Its exclusively male focus aside would seem to have applicability in the case of the life force group, where the initial feeling of the members being loved by Alex gave way to fear of him. Since Freud, the theory of group psychology has been expanded. British psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, drawing on Melanie Klein's ideas about primitive psychological defense in the infant and young child, studied small group phenomena and concluded that groups tend to adopt, unconsciously, one of the three primal emotional states: dependency, pairing, or fight-flight. Bion called these states basic assumptions and thought of them as expressive of disowned impulses. He saw any group as likely to exhibit irrational behavior, indicating that one of the three assumptions is operating. What Bion designates as the dependency assumption group is a very good description of the state of mind prevailing in cults. The essential aim of the dependency assumption group is to attain security through and have its members protected by one individual. It assumes that this is why the group has met. The members act as if they know nothing, as if they are inadequate and immature creatures. Their behavior implies that the leader, by contrast, is omnipotent and omniscient. Object relations theorist D.W. Winnicott has suggested that the group may represent a transitional object for its members, who express regressive themes appropriate to that stage of development. Going further, Jungian analyst Arthur Coleman, drawing on the work of Margaret Mahler, has proposed that group consciousness is a developmental phase prior to full individualization. individuation. All these theorists endeavor to explain the powerful effect of groups from the point of view of the psychology of the individuals that compose them. However, from a sociobiological point of view, there is another basis for understanding why the group should be so influential. Human survival has been enhanced by the tendency for families to combine in bands or tribes for mutual protection and support. As banishment from the larger group could endanger an individual's survival, an acute sensitivity to the group's wishes and requirements probably carried an evolutionary advantage. Socially aware, adept individuals would eventually dominate the genetic pool through the process of natural selection. Perhaps in this way, the human race has developed a high awareness of the wishes, fears, and requirements of the groups on which a person depends. Such an evolutionary process may explain why certain basic group reactions and fantasies, such as those described by Bion, seem to take place regardless of the member's actual family experience. Certainly, whatever theoretical model or models one might prefer, the desire for group approval and the fear of disapproval remain with us as very powerful controlling forces. In the Robinson's case, Hugh's testimony makes clear how much his need for the group's approval influenced him, especially when he was in quarantine. And Clara recalled how seductive it was for the group to praise her while criticizing Hugh. Furthermore, numerous experiments show how a group can change the perception of its members, can even foster and maintain a bizarre, paranoid worldview, such as that which developed within the Life Force executive group. We can feel secure in the protection provided by a group, but that protection has a price. Compliance with the group often extends further than acceptance of the group's views to include participation in the attack on deviance by subtle, or not so subtle, disapproval, punishment, or rejection of any member who voices criticism of the consensus or disagrees with the leader. Dissident is criticized as disloyal, lacking commitment, interfering with the important work of the group. As a psychotherapist, I frequently work with people oppressed by a punitive, controlling internal figure who lashes them with guilt and mocks with disapproval. Exploring the reason for this oppression, we often find that its purpose is to ensure conformity to the group upon whose approval they depend and whose rejection they fear. Although most social groups encourage dependency and compliance in civilized ways, the basic pattern can usually be discerned. Pressures encouraging dependency, present in most groups, are intensified in a cult. As we saw in the case of Hugh and Clara, extreme dependence on the cult is fostered by isolating the members from other sources of self-esteem, financial support, and emotional closeness. Consequently, the cult's ability to reward or punish is markedly enhanced. With this in mind, it is not surprising that a particularly pernicious feature of cults, and often an index of their power over their members, is the attack on couples and families. In the case of Life Force, not a single couple who began with the group survived intact. Even the marriage of Alex and Barbara Monroe failed. This destructive effect is characteristic of the stronger cults. The power of the leader and the sense of security of the group are diminished by any strong social bonds which set up conflicting loyalties. Hugh and Clara's enduring bonds to their child and to each other eventually provided the motivation to break free from the group. Thus, powerful cult groups often attack the couple through arranged marriages, the breaking of love relationships by order of the leader or the group, pressure towards group marriage or chastity, sexual relationships with the leader, and or interfere with the bonds between parents and children. In her study of communes and utopian communities, sociologist Rosabeth Cantor described how in the previous century such groups coped with the threat to cohesiveness posed by two-person intimacy. Successful 19th century groups often discouraged couples in one of two extreme and experientially opposite ways, either through free love, including group marriage in which every member was expected to have intimate sexual relations with all others, or through celibacy in which no member could have sexual relations with any other. She cites the Oneida community, which had been notorious for its practice of free love. Every member had sexual access to every other with his or her consent. While fidelity was negatively sanctioned, preference of one member for another was quickly discouraged. When two members of the community showed a marked preference, one of the member for the other, they were asked to mate with two others. In such communities, ties between parents and children were minimized by varying degrees of communal child care and by restricted contact between mother and child. In the Life Force group, this was accomplished by making inordinate demands on Clara's time and devaluing her contribution as a mother, even labeling it as selfish. The weakening of family structures is not only an issue of loyalty. The role of parent and the roles of husband and wife are adult roles, whereas in a cult, the leader and the group together constitute a parent-child structure in which the adult autonomy has no place. For this reason, it is in the cult's interest to foster the regression of its members to a pre-adult phase of psychosexual development, and such a regression is usually easy to observe. Family unit resists this push. The attack on couples and families is usually restricted to tightly controlled groups that set themselves off from surrounding society. Seldom is it a significant factor in ordinary society. However, the weakening of ties to others so as to strengthen dependency on the group and the leader can be observed in strongly authoritarian political systems such as that which prevailed in Germany's Third Reich. The Hitler Youth were encouraged to regard parents as potential enemies of the glorious new Germany, to inform on them, and to turn them in to the Gestapo for comments critical of the Nazi regime. Many did so. Parents came to fear and distrust their children, while the children scorned their parents as being weak, obstructionist, or traitors. Mao Zedong encouraged a similar split between the generations of China. Compliance and dependency can be strongly enhanced by the groups eliciting a powerful emotional experience. O.L. Streecker, a researcher who interviewed converts to revivalism, gave a composite description of a conversation expressed as it typically occurs in a small revivalist group or church. The prospect is directly confronted with his sins. His physical and psychic space are invaded by these self-confident strangers. He is discomforted and thrown off balance. He becomes anxious. The group tells him that his feelings are caused by his sinfulness. He is overcome with guilt and sadness. He realizes that his life is not working. Eagerly, he confesses his shortcomings, sexual lapses, lies, petty thievery, drug abuse, and so forth. Guided by the group, he prays that God will forgive him and receive him as his child. He is urged, ask Jesus to come into your heart. He does, and the inner turmoil subsides. The recruit senses an inner release and relief. The hugs and congratulations of the group tell him that he belongs, that he has identity, that he is accepted. Many ecstatic converts report, "It was as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders." Trigger suggests that such groups create an unbearable tension in the person on whom they are focusing, and that the sudden release from that tension, accepting the Lord into your heart, or surrender to Jesus, is interpreted as a spiritual experience being born again. He goes on to comment, when Jesus told Nicodemus of the need to be born again, he did not badger his hearer until he underwent a group coerced program stereotyped purgation. Of course, to be born again does not require a specifically Christian context. Listen again, Clara Robinson. So I went up towards the sun, and there was this wise man, and he said to me, "My child." And I climbed in his lap, like a child. He was very much like a father. As I retell it, I realized that I just felt like I was home. I felt a downflow of love and affection that I've never felt before or since. It was that experience that made me feel that I needed to do more of whatever this system was. Groups may enhance compliance and dependency by producing a variety of altered states of consciousness that are easily misinterpreted to conform with the beliefs and interests of the group. Hugh and Clara Robinson always had an intuitive sense of a larger reality that was very important to them. That perception was confused with unresolved dependency longings, leading them to interpret the initial guided daydream as being spiritual and to accept the Monroes as guides or agents in that domain. A variety of techniques, chanting, singing, dancing, sleep deprivation, meditation, can produce a state of consciousness quite impressive to the participant. The event may then be offered as proof of the group's value or the leader's spiritual power. The convert's wish to believe does the rest. Demonstrations of psychic ability are especially potent in this respect, and yogic disciplines in particular seem to have the technology for producing phenomena unexplainable by current scientific knowledge. Some years ago, while investigating a popular Eastern cult, I underwent an initiation in which a yogi placed his hand on my head, and I experienced a spot of intense white light blazing briefly in the center of my mind, or so it seemed. This was interpreted by the cult as contact with the divine, and proof that the guru was a new messiah. I still don't understand how the man did it, but the spot of light was just that, a spot of light. And no more a demonstration of divine than turning on a faucet would be to someone who knows nothing about plumbing. Indeed, the mystical literature warns repeatedly that such experiences are distractions and should be ignored. Nevertheless, this particular group's converts eagerly practiced the prescribed meditations, hoping to repeat the experience and rush to take part in any further initiations that were made available to them. Unfortunately, legitimate but subtle intimations of the spiritual that may have led a convert to search for a group and teacher may be displaced by such dramatic alterations of consciousness, which can then become a further bias for control. Just as the group's emotional support and validation can be provided or withdrawn, so can the dramatic pseudo-spiritual experiences. Before long, the positive force of idealism and service that may have been foremost in the convert's mind when joining a cult becomes corrupted by fear of deprivation and abandonment. As we saw in Life Force, idealistic concepts are then subverted when they are used to rationalize a behavior a convert would have condemned before joining the group. A major way a group exerts power is through threat of censure and expulsion, classifying the deviant as bad. I had occasion to learn about this firsthand a few years ago when I became involved in the anti-nuclear movement. At that time, I would not have believed that liberals such as myself could behave like occult members, although I was certain that right-wingers did. The story is worth telling because it may connect with the reader's own prejudices and provide an experience of the very dynamic I am discussing. In 1980, I attended a weekend conference given by the Physicians for Social Responsibility, entitled The Medical Consequences of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear War. The presentations were intended to impress the audience with the ghastly consequences of nuclear war. That goal was certainly achieved. We were left in a state of great alarm and dread. I responded by becoming active in spreading the word about the enormous danger and immediate steps that should be taken. This was not a new role for me. I had been active in the 1960s in the effort to stop the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. Now the menace was worse, and the catastrophic effects more overwhelming. I raised questions with the other PSR members about what action might be taken to increase their chances of survival if a nuclear war did occur. I was told that there was nothing that could be done, shelters were described as useless, and prevention of nuclear war was the only answer. Some speakers declared that anyone who undertook civil defense planning was immoral, engaged in a highly unethical act. These summary judgments were not convincing to me, and I began reading outside of the peace movement's literature, encountering other points of view and other facts. Eventually, I came to the judgment that the regional food stockpiles would save millions of lives if war did occur, and that by establishing such stockpiles would not accelerate the arms race or give people a false sense of security, but would be a logical and appropriate response to a very real danger. Furthermore, I believe that people should be told that the less alarming facts about radiation danger and about what protection a shelter could and could not offer. When I mentioned these ideas to my friends in the peace movement, they would draw back slightly. Their eyes would narrow. I could see them mentally remove my name from the file of good guys and transfer it to the one marked bad guys. Perhaps you, the reader, have been having a similar reaction. I promoted a lecture about protection against a variety of radiation hazards, including nuclear explosions. Almost no one came except some protesters from the peace movement, with the radiologist who gave the lecture. I later appeared on a radio talk show. It was clear the host found it hard to grasp that although I was in favor of stockpiling food, a civil defense measure, I was opposed to the MX missiles and favored a nuclear freeze. He had assumed, as others did, that I must be a hawk. A cult-like propensity for a black and white division of the world was all too obvious. This publicity, along with an interview published in a local newspaper, generated a response whose character and vehemence caught me by surprise. I was roundly attacked. No one from the peace movement asked me why I thought what I did. They weren't curious at all. They had simply decided I had become a hardliner, an immoral survivalist, and arguments advanced against my views seemed simplistic and illogical, much like the recitations of dogma I was familiar with from my study of religious cults. In addition to seeing the cult process at work in others, I became aware that I was influenced by them. I began to avoid mentioning my views to acquaintances and even some friends for fear of being cast out. Educational as the experience proved, being regarded as a bad guy within my own group was quite unpleasant. At one public hearing where I testified, I was attacked by a peace movement contingent who used the same rhetoric that I had used in the past as part of the same group. They're starting to be on the receiving end, to be the object of the glaring hostile eyes and the impassioned appeals to humanity. Ruefully, I realized that in the past I had been similarly self-indulgent in obtaining the emotional satisfaction that springs from being righteous in a good cause. I would not have known that I was, to some degree, a member of a cult had I not challenged my group's dogma. Compliance with the group increases with one's psychological and economic dependence on it. This can be seen in many institutions, including the corporations that dominate modern economic life. Sociologist Diane Margolis studied the managers at a large corporation and found that one effect of frequent transfers was to decrease a husband and wife's involvement in local politics and community life and to increase their dependence on the friends and activities of their particular corporate world. Moreover, they learned to buy their homes with a view to resale, and this tended to place them in the housing areas occupied by other corporation managers. Economic and social segregation played an important role in the corporation's becoming, for many managers, the chief resource of self-esteem, companionship, and personal expression for the managers of many corporations. Needs usually fulfilled by human relationships became increasingly difficult to satisfy because almost all relationships outside their nuclear families are distant and fleeting. So like half-starved people who in the absence of protein will fatten but not nourish themselves on starches, managers and their families hunger for goods money cannot buy, but reach for those it can. Each year's salary increases put these within easier reach, and the manager's family finds that every purchase just whets the appetite for the next. He knew he was in a game where he could not win, but he played on. For him, It was the only game in town. To leave the company would mean all that sacrifice had been in vain. Security must be given up. Wishful thinking tends to replace critical assessment, just as it did with the Robinsons, who also had to face giving up a warm cocoon with a few connections to the outside world that could easily appear less desirable, and the corporation more valuable than it is. Although corporations did not attack the family directly, in the manner of cults such as Life Force, most of them do require the subordination of the manager's family needs to those of the corporation. This sacrifice is demanded as a price of career advancement. A common practice is to promote managers by transferring them every year or two to positions in other parts of the country. Then their positions are filled by others who are moved in. A game of musical chairs takes place. Certainly it is in the corporation's interest to give managers wide experience and also to test their commitment to the company. However, the interest of the manager's children are served poorly. Although corporations have begun paying more attention to this problem, the transfer is still a standard feature of corporate life. Indeed, in my psychotherapy practice, I often encounter people who have been socially impaired by frequent family moves that made them perpetually new kids on the block. Just when friendships were established, their families would move again. Such children learn to limit their friendships to avoid the pain of loss and tend to interpret other children's reserve toward them when they arrive in a new town as indicating that they are not likable. For many wives, the process is almost as painful. If people know you're going to move, they start to disengage themselves from you. If you find them backing off, you start finding out that they're not there anymore. They're busy, and they're busy with things they know you're going to be doing after you've left. You notice it, people starting to draw back, and the kids. I know I would say that they couldn't get friends to come and play, the other kids would suddenly be busy with somebody else. Even though they've always been with them, the friends were starting to find somebody else because, after all, she's leaving. Frequent transfers are also ruinous to a spouse's career ambitions. The wife of Schlumberger, manager stationed in Cairo, summed it up. Sometimes you feel real lost. Sometimes you really feel lost. The man has a job to do, and you have nothing to do. So you have babies to keep you busy, or you join a club. If you say, I want to have a career of my own, and you say you don't want to give up, you don't want to go where your husband goes, then you're headed for divorce courts. Commitment to the corporation is also measured by a manager's willingness to take work home at night and on weekends, and to be absent from his family on frequent business trips. In the competition for a manager's time, energy, and attention, the corporation is out to win. Conflicts that arise between family needs and corporate needs, which may have the look of accidental occurrences, are sometimes deliberate tests of the person's commitment, the outcomes of which are carefully noted. The manager who chooses family over the corporation fails the test, as does the family. Furthermore, wives become unpaid company employees as they fall in line to support the careers of their husbands. They, the managers, are corporate men, not family men. Wives must actively subordinate themselves to the husband's work aims, at the very least, not interfere with them. The key to an effective partnership would be the degree to which a wife's activity adopted the corporate goals and skillfully aided the husband in that direction. This makes the wife a kind of high-class assistant bound by marriage rather than salary, but otherwise facilitating the work goals with the same sense of efficiency the husband would expect of his secretary and other office personnel. The all-embracing demands of corporate life do not permit distraction. Within the corporate culture of many companies, it is assumed that the corporate goals and the husband's career should have first priority in much the same way that Life Force and other cults regard their own activities as primary and the competing demands of marriage and family as distinctly secondary. As Harold Ganin, former chief officer of ITT, put it, The first requirement of a senior executive is instant availability. He must put his firm above his family, and he must be prepared to go anywhere at any time or simply to wait around in case he is needed. Just as the commitment and spiritual worth of the Robinsons were judged by the extent to which they sacrificed their marriage relationship and their child's needs to the purpose of their group, the loyalty of the corporate manager is usually measured by the acceptance of corporation priorities over anything else in life. Of course, corporations vary in their demands, and some managers sacrifice their family's interest over and above what the corporation requires. Personal ambition can take a toll without any pressure at all from corporate authority.